second graders, and welcome to the tide pools at Oceanside. If we had been able to go on our field trip, we would have explored here and nearby Netarts Bay. Because we can't take you to the tide pools, we wanted to bring them to you. During this virtual field trip, you'll learn what a tide pool is and how to safely explore them. We'll take a closer look at the different zones or habitats in a tide pool, the animals that call those habitats home, and the special adaptations they have to live there. Are you ready to go exploring? What exactly is a tide pool? A tide pool is a shallow pool of water left in low places along the shoreline. You can see tide pools when the tide is low. When the tide is high, these pools are covered with water. Many plants and animals live in the tide pools. The tide pool is their habitat, or home. There are tide pools all around the world. Wherever there is a rocky seashore, there are tide pools, including here in Tillamook County. Now let's take a closer look at a rock in the tide pools that was exposed during low tide. But this isn't any ordinary rock.
Far away, it may just look like a rock, but when we get in closer, you'll see it's actually full of life. There are algae and animals covering each surface of this rock almost. We have a giant green anemone aggregating our paint tint anemones, a snail or gastropod, lots of different weird looking algae like this one, these brown red algae down here, some old green algae, and some pink coralline algae. This whole rock is covered with life.
Whenever we visit the beach or tide pools, we need to remember to be a careful explorer. Keep yourself safe and the animals and plants too by following these easy steps. It is best to go exploring at low tide. Low tide happens when the water goes out, falls, and gets shallow. During this time, more of the beach and tide pools will be exposed and accessible for you to explore. Make sure to have an adult check a tide chart to find out when low tide is. As the tide starts to come back in, the waves will begin to flood the beach and the water will rise. Always remember to keep your eye on the ocean. Even when the tide is low, large waves can surprise you on the beach. Make sure to face the ocean and watch out for sneaker waves. Watch your step. Make sure to watch where you are stepping as you explore. The rocks are full of life, and sometimes plants or animals are even buried in the sand. It's best to always remember to walk on bare sand or rocks when exploring the tide pools. Remember to be as gentle as possible with animals and plants. Touch with just one finger and never poke an animal. Don't try to pull an animal off the rocks either. This could hurt them. Now that we know how to be a careful explorer, let's learn about the plants and animals that live in the tide pools. Living at the edge of the ocean can be a very difficult place to survive. Can you think of some of the things plants and animals must deal with to live here? Waves are constantly going in and out, sometimes with a lot of energy, like during big storms. In order to not be washed away, animals and plants have to hold on tight. Twice a day, the beach is flooded with water during a time called high tide. Tides are caused by the pull of the sun and the moon on the earth. That pull from the sun and the moon also causes the tide to go out twice a day during a time called low tide. During low tide, lots of places that were covered with water dry out and are exposed to the air. Animals and plants living in the tide pools must find a way to survive when the water levels drop. To help them survive these changes, animals and plants find homes in different places. This creates layers of habitats or zones. Can you see the different zones here? Animals and plants find homes on the rocks in a place they survive the best. We name these different zones based on how long they are exposed or out of water during low tide.
Okay, we are in the intertidal area, and I want to talk about a phenomenon called zonation. You know, the tides come in and out, so some organisms are almost always underwater, some are almost never underwater. And I think I'm going to get wet here again, but you'll see near the tops of the rocks, I'm going to zoom in on that, you see bare rocks, and then you see all these little white things that are acorn barnacles, and they live in the very top area of the intertidal zone called the splash zone or spray zone. And they go down a little farther and you'll see mussels and other barnacles. And that's still it's called the upper intertidal zone. And we always have to have names for these. And they go down a little farther and you'll see different kinds of organisms like other types of barnacles, anemones, and I'm going to swing around here a little bit. You see the anemones, and then finally you get down low enough, and this is the lower intertidal, and you can see the big green anemones, and occasionally you'll see a starfish, and you'll see different types of kelps that only are exposed at the very lowest tides. That's called the lower intertidal zone. Anything that's not exposed ever is in the subtidal zone.
So if we look up really high, you'll see a speckling of white animals. This up there, just above the mussel line, these are the mussels right here, that's called the splash zone. Those animals are so hardy, they really just need a spray of seawater to survive. Anything that lives there has to be able to dry out or has to be able to move to get to water once it starts flooding back in, like it is right now.
Let's take a closer look at some of the animals that live in the splash zone. Acorn barnacles and all barnacles are crustaceans like crabs, lobsters, and shrimp. Unlike other crustaceans, however, adult barnacles are sessile, meaning they cannot move. Barnacle larvae, or baby barnacles, are planktonic, meaning they float around in the ocean currents. But once they reach a certain age, they settle, attach to a hard surface like a rock, and surround themselves with a strong shell, and never move again. Acorn barnacles and barnacle species are able to survive in the splash and high tide zones by tightly closing their shells to prevent from drying out. Barnacles filter feed on small plankton and other particles from the water using their modified legs, which look like fans pulling water into their shells. Snails and limpets also live in the splash zone and high tide zone. Limpets are related to snails, but instead of having a spiral shell, their shell is cone-shaped.
This particular limpet lives fairly high up in the intertidal zone. Just keep from losing moisture by sealing themselves to the rock. Foot, great big foot. And their mouth is on this side. And that's what they stick to the rock, how they stick to the rock.
With the mouth?
No, with the foot.
With the foot.
Uh-huh. And they just kind of suck on there.
Okay.
And then they feed by moving around and scraping little microalgae off the rock.
Acorn barnacles, limpets, and other animals that live in the splash zone are specially adapted to survive for long periods out of the water, living off just the spray of the ocean waves that they sometimes receive. Just slightly lower in the intertidal is the high tide zone.
This is the high tide zone. Right? This is exposed more often, but not as often as the spray zone is. Right in here you get lots of mussels, you get lots of gooseneck barnacles, lots of limpets and snails. And if you were to reach in there and dig this open, there'd be a lot of animals that are surviving in between all these crevices. You might find worms, you might find crabs that are staying safe and moist using these mussels as protection. You'll also notice that on just one mussel shell like this one, you scan in really close, it's a whole habitat in itself. Look at that. Ooh, it's squirting. Look at all of the barnacles living on this one mussel shell. Lots of different types of barnacles. Isn't it nice? Look at that. You can really see the neck of the gooseneck barnacle.
What is that? A barnacle?
Yeah, it's a gooseneck barnacle, but you can
Yeah, that's right. Okay.
can see there's a little tiny mussel. And these mussels all hang on with these threads.
Hang on for dear life.
These are called Bissell threads, and they're super duper strong. And they just shoot a whole bunch of them out, and then they're stuck to each other with them. We call them, seafood processor people will call them beards because they look like beards hanging off of the mussels. But that's how they stay attached to things, and they can make them really quickly. So they get detached. If they're lucky, they can reattach.
During high tide, the high tide zone is underwater, and animals like mussels and gooseneck barnacles are able to feed. Mussels open their shell just a little bit to eat plankton and tiny dead plants and animals, called detritus, drifting through the water. Small hair-like structures inside the mussel, called cilia, create a current pulling water in, from which they are then able to eat their food. California mussels, like these, can filter 2 to 3 quarts of water an hour. Gooseneck barnacles differ from the acorn barnacles in that they have a long stalk that attaches to a hard surface. This stalk helps them to stretch out into the water column when filtering food. Like acorn barnacles, they use their modified feet to filter plankton and detritus out of the water. They also use these feathery appendages to breathe. Shall we speed the pace of this video up so we can really see these mussels and gooseneck barnacles in action? Okay. Plants and animals that live in the high tide zone are specially adapted to the changing conditions. Because they are out of the water most of the time, except at high tide, they have to be able to keep from drying out, like how the mussel and gooseneck barnacles close securely when they are exposed. Many animals in the high tide zone are stuck tightly to the rocks to help withstand the crashing waves. Moving a little lower in the intertidal are plants and animals that live in the middle tide zone. They are exposed to the air twice a day during low tide and have to withstand crashing waves as the tide comes back in. Here we start to find animals with softer bodies because they are underwater for longer periods.
Then as you scan down, you'll see the end of the mussel line right here. Now you're getting into the mid-tide zone. Sea stars in particular really love to munch on mussels, but they don't like to get too dried out. This is about as far as a sea star can go and live. And above that, it will get too dried out. It wants to stay below it. So any mussel that goes below this line is going to get munched on by a sea star. Any mussel that grows above it has a chance of surviving and staying wet. So here's a perfect example because these guys are right on the cusp of the mussels. And so they're right here, sneaking up as far as they can go, munching any mussel they can find.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about starfish, or sea stars. The ones we have here, the most obvious ones, is the ochre star. And they come in different colors, the same species, but they can range in color from kind of a yellow-orange to purple or dark brown. You can see this one is kind of purplish. Their favorite food is the mussel. And they often limit the mussel to how far down in the intertidal zone they will grow. And how do they feed? Well, the starfish has what are called tube feet. These are little suction cups on the underside of them. And they will wrap their arms around the mussel, attach those tube feet to the shells, the two shells, and start pulling it apart. Well, the mussel likes to hold its two shells together, but when the starfish keeps pulling and pulling and pulling, finally the two shells of the mussel start to open up a little bit. Then the starfish will extrude its stomach inside out, down into the mussel, through the gape in the shells, and digest the mussel in its own shells.
Tube feet not only help a sea star to pry open a mussel shell to feed, but they also help them hold tight to rocks and move around when the tide is up. If we speed this video up, we can really see how the sea star's tube feet help it move underwater. Another animal found in the middle tide zone is the aggregating anemone. When underwater, these anemones have bright pink tentacles that they extend into the water to help them catch their prey. The tentacles have special stinging cells that help them catch their prey and bring it to their mouths, which are in the middle of their bodies. When we touch these tentacles, they feel sticky because the anemone is actually stinging us, but luckily we're too big and our skin is too thick to help to feel any pain. To a small fish or crab, however, the stings can be paralyzing. Anemones are voracious feeders that eat almost anything that passes by, such as falling mussels, barnacle molts, and small fishes. The aggregating anemone can even ingest small crabs and spew out the shells. Out of the water, aggregating anemones look like little green blobs on the rocks. When they are exposed to the air, they hold water inside their stomachs and pull their tentacles in tightly. This helps prevent them from drying out. Looking closely, you can spot hundreds and even thousands of them on just one rock in colonies.
So this is actually one family, and this is another family, and these guys clone. So that means that they will actually stretch apart and then divide into two. And so this is all one clone family, and this is another clone family. And one clone family doesn't like to be near another clone family. So when the water comes in, this right along this line they fight. So they have, my friend always calls it clone wars.
Being exposed to the air twice a day during low tides, animals like aggregating anemones and ochre sea stars are able to live in the middle tide zone through special adaptations. Sea stars use their suction cup-like tube feet to hold on tight, move around, and pry open mussel shells for food, while anemones use their tentacles to catch passing prey underwater and hold water in their bodies to keep from drying out when they are exposed to the air. Plants and animals that are covered by water most of the time and only exposed to the air during very low tides live in the low tide zone. Even when they are uncovered, they tend to be close to the edge of the water, waiting until the tide comes back in.
Tide, and as we get even deeper, we call that the low tide zone. It's only exposed during the lowest tides. So when the tide goes out the furthest, that's the only time it's exposed. So it stays wet almost all the time. And so these animals that live here prefer to stay in the seawater as much as possible. They're not able to live up where it gets more dry.
You'll rarely find sea urchins out of the water. These purple sea urchins were found in a shallow pool of water that remained behind when the tide went out, which is one of the reasons there are so many of them in this one tide pool. A purple sea urchin's pincushion appearance comes from its round inner shell called a test. The test is covered with pinchers, tube feet, and purple spines that move on ball and socket joints. The spines spear food and protect an urchin from predators. Just like their sea star relatives, an urchin uses its many tube feet to move along rocks, sand, and other surfaces. And if food happens to land on an urchin's back, all those tube feet pass the food down to the urchin's mouth like a bucket brigade. These purple sea urchins feed on different types of seaweed. 5 tooth-like plates called Aristotle's lantern surrounds an urchin's mouth on the underside of its test. An urchin uses its teeth and spines to dig holes in stones, which become the sea urchin's hideaway, helping to protect them from crashing waves. Sometimes a sea urchin grows larger than its dugout and is in for life. Then it must depend on food drifting to it. Here we see some of the purple sea urchin's favorite foods, seaweed, also called algae or kelp. Remember how we keep mentioning the animals and plants that live in the intertidal? Well, when we say plants, we mean the numerous types of algae found in the tide pools. Just like plants on land, algae convert the sun's energy into food through a process called photosynthesis. Algae species come in many different colors, sizes, shapes, and textures. Some look like palm trees or even dense forests, and others look like pink, crusty bark. Let's take a look at some of the different seaweeds you might find in the low tide zone.
I want to talk a little bit about seaweeds. They come in 3 different groups: the brown seaweeds, the red seaweeds, and the green seaweeds. The one we see right here, as I focus down on it, is called the acid kelp, and it contains sulfuric acid. It's one of those that you probably wouldn't want to eat. Most of them you can't eat. It's the brown. Here's another one. It's in the red group. And as we get up a little closer here, in the higher intertidal, there is the sea lettuce, which is in the green group. Now,
as you explore the low tide zone, you might see what you think is a snail, only to have it move way too quickly. Instead of a snail, it's a hermit crab who's made its home in an empty snail shell. Hermit crabs carry a shell on their back to help protect themselves from predators. They rarely leave the security of their shell. If they sense danger, they will tuck themselves into their shell and block the opening with their big claw. If a hermit crab grows too big for its shell, it will find a new, better-fitting shell to move into. Like all crabs, the hermit crab is a decapod. It has 5 pairs of legs, including a pair of claws. The hermit crab uses its claws for defense and food shredding, as well as eating. One of the hermit crab's claws is much larger than the other one. The second and third pair of legs help the crab walk and grip onto rocks, and the last 2 pairs hold the hermit crab in its shell. Hermit crabs have long antennae to help them feel around as they look for food. Their eyes are on stalks, which helps them to get a better all-around view of their environment. While these hermit crabs may look similar to those you'd find in a pet store, there is a big difference. The crabs at the pet store are land hermit crabs and can breathe air. The hermit crabs found in the tide pools live in the ocean and use gills to breathe underwater. They can hold their breath for short periods of time while scurrying from one tide pool to another, but they eventually have to get back into the water to survive. Eventually needing to be underwater is something that all animals and plants living in the intertidal have in common, from the low tide zone all the way up to the splash zone. The zone that each lives in determines how much time that animal or plant will be exposed to the air each day, and the special adaptations that they have to survive. Can you remember some of the ways animals and plants survive in the different zones? What other adaptations might an animal have to hold on tightly, find food, or keep from drying out in the tide pools? We're so glad you could join us as we explored the tide pools at Oceanside and learned about some of the plants and animals that call the intertidal home. The next time you head out to the beach, make sure to take a closer look at the rocks and in the shallow pools to see what life you can find.